There is a strange reason why some people remain calm while everyone else is falling apart. It has nothing to do with talent. It has nothing to do with luck. And it has almost nothing to do with intelligence. Carl Jung believed that the strongest people in the world were not the ones who defeated others. They were the ones who had the courage to face something that most people spend their entire lives trying to escape. The frightening part is that this hidden force is already inside you, right now. But if you never recognize it, it can quietly control every decision you make without you even realizing it. Imagine waking up every morning believing your biggest enemies are outside. Difficult people, bad luck, money problems, rejection, failure. But what if the real enemy has been living inside your own mind since childhood? What if every relationship you've ruined, every opportunity you've missed, every moment you doubted yourself was connected by one invisible thread? Jung spent decades studying dreams, myths, religion, and the darkest corners of the human mind because he became convinced that people weren't destroyed by the world. They were destroyed by the parts of themselves they refused to see. And here's what makes this even more unsettling. Jung discovered that the people who learn to face this hidden darkness often become calmer, wiser, more disciplined, and surprisingly more successful than those who spend their lives pretending everything is fine. He called it one of the greatest psychological transformations a human being could experience. But almost nobody talks about what it actually demands. Because once you understand it, you can never look at yourself the same way again. Before we go any further, I want to know something. Where are you watching from today? Leave your city in the comments. And tell me this. Have you ever felt like there's another version of yourself hidden beneath the person everyone knows? I'm curious to read your answer. If you're fascinated by psychology, self-mastery, and the hidden truths of the human mind, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Now let's uncover what Jung believed most people never dare to discover. Picture a quiet evening in Switzerland. The air feels cold. The streets are almost empty. Inside a room lit by a single lamp, a man sits alone surrounded by books, handwritten notes, ancient symbols, and sketches pulled straight from his dreams. That man is Carl Jung. While the rest of the world searched for answers in politics, science, or religion alone, Jung turned his attention inward. He believed the greatest mystery wasn't somewhere out in the universe. It was inside every human mind. That idea sounded almost unbelievable at the time. Many dismissed him. Others admired him. But Jung wasn't interested in pleasing anyone. He was chasing a truth that frightened even him. As a young psychiatrist, Jung quickly earned the respect of one of the most influential thinkers in psychology, Sigmund Freud. Their conversations lasted for hours. They challenged each other constantly. Freud saw Jung as the future of psychoanalysis, almost like the sun who would carry his life's work forward. For a while, it seemed unstoppable. Two brilliant minds working toward the same goal. But beneath the surface, something was changing. Jung couldn't ignore what he kept observing in his patients. Again and again, people suffered not only because of painful memories or childhood trauma. They were haunted by something deeper. They were terrified of confronting aspects of themselves they had buried so completely that they no longer knew those parts existed. That observation would eventually create one of the greatest intellectual breakups in modern history. And here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Imagine carrying around a backpack every day without realizing. Someone keeps adding stones to it. At first, the weight is barely noticeable. You move normally. You laugh. You work. You build relationships. Years pass. More stones are added. A betrayal. An insecurity. Jealousy you refuse to admit. Anger you hide behind fake smiles. Fear disguised as perfectionism. Eventually, the backpack becomes so heavy that every step feels exhausting. Yet you still blame the road instead of the weight you're carrying. Jung believed that's exactly how the human mind works. He called this hidden collection of denied emotions. Instincts, fears, desires, and impulses the shadow. The word itself sounds mysterious, almost sinister. But the shadow isn't evil by nature. It's simply everything you've learned to reject about yourself. Think back to childhood. Maybe you were told not to cry because crying meant weakness. So you buried sadness. Maybe you learned that anger made people uncomfortable. So you buried anger. Maybe your creativity was laughed at. So you buried imagination. Maybe you were taught that wanting success or wealth was selfish. So ambition disappeared into the darkness. Those rejected pieces never vanished. They waited, quietly, patiently, watching from beneath your conscious awareness. And one day they started making decisions for you, not because they wanted to destroy you, because they wanted to be acknowledged. Most people never realize that's happening. Instead, they say things like, I don't know why I always sabotage myself. I don't know why I keep choosing the wrong relationships. I don't know why I lose motivation every time I'm close to succeeding. Jung would probably ask a completely different question. What part of yourself have you abandoned? That single question changes everything, because the shadow doesn't disappear when you ignore it, or it grows stronger, like a room locked for decades. It fills with dust until, eventually, the door can barely open. But here's a detail almost nobody expects. Shadow doesn't only contain fear, also hides your greatest strengths, your confidence, your courage, your creativity, your leadership, your discipline. Sometimes people bury their brightest qualities simply because someone once made them feel guilty for shining. That's why two people can have the same opportunity, the same intelligence, and the same resources, yet produce completely different lives. One spends years fighting the world. The other begins by understanding themselves, and the difference becomes impossible to ignore. This is exactly why Jung believed that real transformation never begins with changing your job, your bank account, your relationship, or your environment. It begins the moment you stop running from your own reflection. But if the shadow is only one piece of the puzzle, then what was the mysterious force Jung believed every human being shares, even across different countries, cultures, and thousands of years of history? The answer led him to one of the most controversial discoveries of his entire career, and it would change the way psychologists think about the human mind forever. That question haunted Jung for the rest of his life, not because he lacked answers, but because every answer uncovered an even deeper mystery. He understood something that our modern world still struggles to accept. The greatest prison is not built with concrete walls. It is built with unconscious habits, borrowed beliefs, silent fears, and identities we never chose. Most people spend decades decorating that prison. Instead of looking for the key. Look around for a moment. How many people are living according to expectations they never questioned? They wake up exhausted, rush through another day, smile when they don't feel like smiling, chase goals they never truly wanted, and fall asleep, wondering why life feels strangely empty. They tell themselves they're being responsible. They convince themselves that one day, when they finally earn enough money, buy the bigger house, receive the promotion, or gain the recognition they crave, everything will make sense. But that day rarely arrives, because the emptiness was never caused by a lack of achievement. It was caused by a lack of connection with the deepest parts of themselves. Jung believed that every human being carries an inner calling, not a voice that speaks through sound, but one that whispers through intuition, recurring dreams, unexpected emotions, and moments of profound silence. The tragedy is that those whispers become almost impossible to hear when life is filled with constant noise. That is why silence is so powerful. Silence is where masks begin to crack. Silence is where excuses lose their strength. Silence is where the ego slowly stops performing. And once the performance ends, something extraordinary begins. The real person finally has room to breathe. Think about the moments that changed your life the most. Were they loud? Or did they happen during quiet conversations, lonely walks, sleepless nights, or those moments when you suddenly realized you could no longer keep living the same way? Real transformation is rarely dramatic in the beginning. It often starts with a single decision. I can't keep lying to myself. That sentence has the power to change an entire future. Jung knew this because he lived it. After separating from Freud, he could have spent the rest of his career defending his reputation or attacking those who criticized him. Instead, he chose the harder path. He continued exploring the human psyche with relentless curiosity, even when many people dismissed his ideas as strange or too mystical. Time eventually proved that many of his insights would influence psychology, literature, philosophy, education, leadership, and even modern neuroscience in surprising ways. His work continues to inspire millions because it speaks to something timeless. Every human being eventually reaches a crossroads. One road leads toward comfort, the other leads toward truth. Comfort asks you to stay the same. Truth asks you to become someone new. Comfort protects your ego. Truth transforms your character. Comfort keeps you accepted by everyone. Truth sometimes requires walking alone, and that is why so few people choose it. They mistake loneliness for failure. They mistake silence for weakness. They mistake self-reflection for overthinking. Yet history repeatedly shows that the men and non-women who leave the deepest mark on the world usually spend long periods alone, questioning themselves before they ever attempt to change anything around them. Jung never encouraged isolation for its own sake. He encouraged conscious solitude. There is a difference. Isolation disconnects you from life. Solitude reconnects you with yourself. In solitude, you begin noticing patterns you ignored for years. You recognize how often fear disguised itself as logic. You realize how many decisions were made simply to avoid criticism. You begin seeing the invisible chains that once felt normal. And once you see them, it becomes almost impossible to wear them again. This is where authentic confidence is born, not from pretending to be fearless, not from believing you're better than everyone else, but from knowing that whatever life places in front of you, you are willing to face it honestly. That kind of confidence cannot be bought. It cannot be inherited. It cannot be faked. It is earned through countless private battles that nobody else ever sees. The world celebrates public victories. Jung understood the importance of private ones. Every time you choose discipline over impulse, every time you tell the truth instead of protecting your image, every time you confront your shadow instead of projecting it onto someone else. Every time you refuse to let bitterness define your future, you become a little freer, a little stronger, a little more whole. That is the real meaning of success. Money can amplify that journey. It can create opportunities. It can provide security. It can increase your ability to help others. But money alone cannot produce peace. Only inner alignment can do that. The people who seem truly unshakable usually have something in common. Their confidence does not depend on applause. Their discipline does not depend on motivation. Their identity does not depend on success. And their peace does not disappear when life becomes difficult. That is why setbacks no longer destroy them. Failure becomes information. Pain becomes a teacher. Silence becomes an ally. Even uncertainty becomes an invitation to grow. Perhaps that is the hidden lesson behind everything Carl Jung tried to teach. The goal of life is not to become perfect. It is to become complete. Not to stop rejecting pieces of yourself. Not to stop living according to borrowed expectations. To stop searching outside for what can only be discovered within. Because the greatest treasure you will ever uncover is not buried beneath the ground. It is buried beneath years of fear. And every honest step you take toward yourself removes another layer. Until one day, almost without realizing it, you look back at the person you used to be. The anxiety that once controlled every decision no longer speaks as loudly. The need to impress everyone has quietly disappeared. The constant comparison has lost its grip. You still face problems. You still experience loss. You still make mistakes. But now you face them as someone who knows who they are. And that changes everything. So before this video ends, I want to leave you with one final thought. Tonight, when the world grows quiet and there is no one around to impress, no audience to entertain, no expectations to satisfy, ask yourself a question that only you can answer. Who am I when nobody is watching? Don't answer too quickly. Sit with the silence. Listen carefully. The first answer may come from your persona. The second may come from your fear. But if you remain there long enough, beneath the noise, memories, beneath the excuses, you may hear something else. The voice of the person you were always meant to become. And if that voice speaks to you tonight, don't ignore it, because your entire future may depend on whether you have the courage to listen. If this journey made you see yourself differently, let me know in the comments which lesson impacted you the most. And remember this, the next time life becomes difficult, the strongest person in the room is not always the loudest, the richest, or the most admired. More often than not, it is the one who has already faced the darkness within and found the courage to walk toward the light. Jung called that journey individuation. It sounds like an academic word, but the experience is anything but intellectual. It is raw, uncomfortable, beautiful, terrifying. It is the slow process of becoming the person you were always capable of. Being before fear, expectations, and the opinions of others began shaping your identity. Imagine standing in front of a mirror that doesn't reflect your face. Instead, it reflects every decision you've avoided, every truth you've refused to admit, every dream you've abandoned because someone convinced you it was impossible. Most people would turn away after a few seconds. Jung believed that the people willing to keep looking become almost impossible to break. That doesn't mean life suddenly becomes easy. It means you stop fighting the wrong battles. So many people spend years trying to control things that were never under their control. They obsess over what strangers think. They replay conversations that ended weeks ago. They compare themselves to people whose real lives they will never know. Their minds become crowded with invisible noise. Meanwhile, the truly disciplined person begins eliminating that noise. Not through denial, through awareness. Jung often reminded us that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That single sentence has changed countless lives because it exposes something uncomfortable. What many people call destiny is often nothing more than unconscious repetition. Think about the person who keeps entering toxic relationships. They swear every partner is different, yet somehow the same ending repeats itself. Think about the entrepreneur who builds a successful business but sabotages every opportunity to grow beyond a certain point. Think about the employee who dreams of changing careers but spends years waiting for the perfect moment. On the surface, these situations seem unrelated. Underneath, they may all share the same hidden cause, an unconscious belief, a childhood wound, a fear of rejection, a fear of success, a fear of becoming visible. Until those forces are recognized, the pattern simply changes its clothes and returns. This is why silence became so important in Jung's philosophy. The silence of isolation. The silence that allows you to hear yourself again. Modern life makes that increasingly difficult. Every spare second is filled with notifications, music, videos, endless scrolling, opinions, arguments, headlines, and distractions. We are constantly connected to everyone except ourselves. Jung would probably say that many people aren't afraid of silence because silence is empty. They're afraid because silence is where the truth begins speaking. Have you ever noticed how uncomfortable complete silence can feel? After only a few minutes, thoughts begin appearing from nowhere. Regrets, dreams, old memories, questions you've been avoiding. That's not your mind malfunctioning. That's your unconscious finally having room to breathe. And this is where real power begins. Not when you become louder than everyone else. When you become impossible to manipulate because you understand yourself. Imagine two people losing the same job. One immediately concludes, I'm worthless. The other thinks, this hurts, but it doesn't define me. The external event is identical. The internal world changes everything. That inner stability becomes one of the greatest competitive advantages a human being can develop. It improves leadership because emotionally stable people make clearer decisions under pressure. It improves relationships because they stop demanding that others heal wounds they refuse to face themselves. It improves financial decisions because fear no longer dictates every investment, every purchase, or every risk. It improves discipline because motivation is replaced by purpose. This is why so many successful individuals speak about knowing themselves before they speak about strategies. Skills matter. Knowledge matters. Hard work matters, but without psychological stability, even extraordinary opportunities can be wasted. Jung never promised unlimited wealth. He never claimed psychology was a shortcut to success. What he suggested was far more realistic. When your inner world becomes ordered, your outer world often begins reflecting that order. Not magically, practically. You procrastinate less. You react less emotionally. You communicate more honestly. You recognize manipulation more quickly. You stop chasing approval. You become more patient. Small improvements compound over years until your entire life looks different. People watching from the outside call it luck. They never see the thousands of invisible decisions that created it. This transformation doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens quietly. One honest conversation. One uncomfortable truth. One fear confronted. One habit changed. One boundary established. One morning, you wake up and realize that the problems which once controlled your life no longer have the same power. Not because they disappeared, because you changed. There is another concept Jung explored that fascinates psychologists to this day: the relationship between the masculine and feminine dimensions of the psyche, which he described as the animus and the anima. He believed that every person carries unconscious qualities that complement their conscious personality. When these inner forces remain ignored, people often project unrealistic expectations onto others. They search for someone else to complete what they have never developed within themselves. How many relationships fail not because love disappears, but because two unconscious people expect each other to heal lifelong emotional wounds? Jung believed mature love begins only after self-knowledge begins. Otherwise, we don't truly love the other person. We love the image we've projected onto them. That realization is painful, but it is also liberating, because it shifts responsibility back into your own hands. No longer are you waiting for the perfect partner, the perfect opportunity, or the perfect circumstances to finally become the person you want to be. You begin now, exactly where you are, with exactly what you have. And perhaps that is Jung's greatest lesson of all. Transformation is never found by escaping yourself. It is found by meeting yourself completely. The light inside you becomes stronger only after you've stopped fearing the darkness. The strongest people are rarely the loudest people. They don't need constant validation. They don't waste energy proving themselves to strangers. They move with quiet confidence because they know something the world often forgets. The greatest victory is never over another human being. It is over the chaos within yourself. And once that victory begins, every decision, every relationship, every challenge, and every success carries an entirely different meaning. The question is, if the person you've been pretending to be disappeared tomorrow, would the real you finally be free? Or would you discover you've never truly met yourself at all? Jung began noticing something that refused to fit inside the traditional theories of psychology. Patients from completely different backgrounds, who had never met each other, described dreams with astonishing similarities. Ancient symbols kept appearing: wise old men, mysterious women, dark forests, serpents, great floods, heroes descending into caves before returning transformed. It happened too often to be dismissed as coincidence. The deeper he investigated mythology, religion, literature, and ancient civilizations, the stranger it became. Cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years shared nearly identical stories. Different languages, different beliefs. Yet the same symbolic patterns emerged again and again. Jung believed humanity wasn't connected only by history. He believed we were connected by something much deeper. He called it the collective unconscious. Imagine entering a library so vast that no one has ever reached its final shelf. Every generation leaves behind invisible knowledge. Every victory, every tragedy, every fear, every hope becomes another page stored somewhere beyond conscious awareness. According to Jung, each of us is born carrying access to that hidden library. At first, the idea sounds impossible, but think about it. Why do children who have never heard certain stories instinctively recognize the difference between a hero and a villain? Why do nearly all civilizations create legends about sacrifice, transformation, love, betrayal, and rebirth? Why do certain dreams feel strangely familiar, even when we've never experienced anything like them? Jung believed those recurring patterns were expressions of archetypes. And this is where the conversation becomes personal, because archetypes aren't just ancient myths. They're alive inside you. The hero who wants to overcome fear, the sage searching for wisdom, the king who creates order, the rebel who refuses to accept limitations, the caregiver who sacrifices everything for others, the explorer who longs for freedom every day. These invisible forces influence your choices without asking permission. The problem isn't that they exist. The problem is that most people never recognize which one is driving their lives. And when you don't understand the forces operating inside your own mind, someone else eventually learns how to manipulate them. Advertising understands this. Politics understands this. Social media understands this. They know that emotions almost always move faster than logic. That's why people buy things they don't need, compare themselves to strangers, chase approval from people they'll never meet, and slowly lose touch with who they really are. Jung warned about this long before smartphones existed. He believed the greatest danger wasn't technology. It was unconscious living. A person who never examines their own mind can spend decades believing they are making independent decisions, while quietly following fears planted years earlier. Think about how many people wake up every morning already exhausted. Not because they work too hard, because they're performing. They're wearing a mask. Jung had a name for that mask. He called it the persona. The persona isn't fake by itself. It's necessary. You speak differently with your family than with your boss. You behave differently during a job interview than with your closest friends. That's natural. The danger begins when the mask becomes your identity. Imagine an actor who plays the same character every day for 30 years until one morning he wakes up unable to remember who he really is. That's exactly what happens to millions of people. They become successful, but empty. Popular. But lonely. Financially comfortable, but emotionally disconnected. From the outside, everything looks perfect. Inside, something feels painfully missing. Have you ever met someone who seemed to have everything yet looked exhausted the moment they thought nobody was watching? Jung believed that exhaustion comes from carrying a life that doesn't belong to your authentic self. And here's where many people misunderstand success. Money itself isn't the enemy. Jung never argued that wealth was wrong. In fact, psychological maturity often allows people to build healthier relationships with money because they're no longer trying to use it to fill emotional emptiness. Think about the difference. One person works desperately because they believe their value depends on becoming rich. Another builds wealth because they have purpose, discipline, patience, and emotional stability. Both may earn millions. Only one experiences peace. That's a massive difference. Marcus Aurelius wrote about mastering the mind. Seneca warned against becoming enslaved by possessions. Epictetus taught that freedom begins when you stop giving external events power over your inner life. Jung approached the same mountain from another path. He believed external success becomes dangerous when it grows faster than internal development. Without self-awareness, power amplifies chaos. Without emotional maturity, wealth amplifies insecurity. Without purpose, achievement amplifies emptiness. History offers endless proof. How many celebrities reached unimaginable fame only to collapse under addictions, depression, broken relationships, or self-destruction? From the outside, they appeared victorious. Inside, they had declared war on themselves. Jung believed no amount of applause could silence an ignored shadow. Then something happened in Jung's own life that forced him to test every theory he had ever developed. His friendship with Freud finally collapsed. It wasn't a simple disagreement. It was devastating. Freud believed Jung had abandoned the foundation of psychoanalysis. Jung believed psychology had to go much deeper than Freud was willing to accept. Their final separation left Jung emotionally shattered. For years afterward, he experienced vivid dreams, terrifying visions, and overwhelming psychological experiences that many people around him could barely understand. Some believed he was losing his mind. Jung feared the same thing. Instead of running away, he did something extraordinary. He walked directly into the chaos. He documented his dreams. He painted symbolic images. He confronted terrifying figures emerging from his unconscious, instead of suppressing them. Those experiences eventually became the foundation of what many now know through his famous Red Book. Jung later admitted that this inner descent transformed him completely. He didn't escape suffering. He learned to listen to it. That's a lesson our culture rarely teaches. Most people want discomfort to disappear immediately. Jung asked a different question. What if your suffering is trying to tell you something? Not every pain carries wisdom, but ignored pain often returns louder. It appears as anxiety. It appears as rage. It appears as endless distraction. It appears as burnout. It appears as relationships that repeat the same painful pattern over and over again. Until finally, life forces you to stop. And when that moment arrives, you have two choices. You can keep blaming the world, or you can begin the most difficult conversation you'll ever have. Conversation with yourself. But even that isn't the final destination, because Jung believed there was one psychological journey greater than confronting the shadow itself. A journey so demanding that very few people ever complete it. He called it the process that turns an ordinary life into an authentic one. And once it begins, there is no going back.